Hello, my name is Liam, and I never thought the day would come when my own son would look me in the eye, shake my hand firmly, and whisper words that would shatter me completely. "This will be the last time you ever see me," he said. And I remember the weight in his grip, the cold certainty in his voice. I had raised him, sacrificed for him, poured every ounce of my life into him, and yet in that moment I realized I was nothing but a stranger in my own home. That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying his words, feeling disbelief and heartbreak crash over me in waves I couldn't control. The next morning brought a nightmare I wasn't ready for. His bank account had been frozen. Every dollar he had saved, every plan he had for his future, all gone, unreachable, locked away. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting with panic and shame. How could this happen? How had I been blind to it all? And then came the whispers. Neighbors, distant relatives, even acquaintances I barely knew, all casting subtle glances, murmuring judgments. My own family avoided me. I felt invisible, humiliated, abandoned in the world I thought I had built for him. I tried to reach him. I called, I texted, I begged, but the silence was absolute. It was deafening, echoing in every corner of my life, making me question everything I thought I knew about trust, loyalty, and family. And yet, buried under that pain, a spark ignited, a simmering determination. I would not crumble. He thought he could hurt me, humiliate me, erase me from his life, but he had underestimated one thing: the lengths I was willing to go to reclaim what was mine, to make him understand the father he thought he could betray. Days passed and I started to notice patterns, subtle manipulations I had missed before. He wasn't just distant, he was orchestrating everything deliberately, controlling accounts, manipulating people, even exploiting my own weaknesses. The realization cut deep, sharper than any knife. And that's when the anger settled in, cold and precise. The pain turned into a plan, a careful, calculated revenge that would make him realize the mistake he had made. He had underestimated his father. He had underestimated me, and soon he would pay. For days after that, I moved through my house like a ghost. I watched him from a distance, pretending everything was normal while my mind was racing, planning, calculating. Every detail mattered now, the people he trusted, the accounts he used, the habits he thought I didn't notice. It was like peeling back layers of someone I thought I knew, discovering the stranger beneath the familiar face. I felt the sting of betrayal every time I caught myself thinking about all the moments I had sacrificed for him. The nights I stayed awake worrying, the chances I had given him only to have him turn my own generosity against me. And yet, amid the humiliation, there was something darker growing inside me, a quiet, patient rage, the kind that waits for the perfect moment to strike. The first sign that my plan could work came unexpectedly. I noticed a recurring pattern in the way he handled his finances, a series of digital footprints that he left behind without realizing it. It was small, almost insignificant, but to me it was a lifeline. I spent hours analyzing, memorizing, preparing. I knew if I played my cards right, I could turn his own arrogance against him. The irony wasn't lost on me. The boy who thought he had outsmarted his father had left himself completely exposed. That thought alone made my stomach tighten with a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. One evening I confronted him, though not in the way he expected. I invited him for dinner, casual, calm, smiling in a way that hid the storm brewing inside me. He sat across from me, distant, guarded, smug even, thinking he had already won. I could feel the contempt in his eyes, the way he measured me as if I was beneath him. I let him feel it, the quiet arrogance of a man who thinks he's untouchable. I didn't say a word about the frozen bank account. I didn't accuse him. I simply let the silence hang between us, a heavy, suffocating tension that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. It was the first small victory of many, a taste of what was coming, though he had no idea. As the night stretched on, I realized just how deep the betrayal went. Friends, co-workers, even family members had been used as pawns in his little game. And yet there was a part of me that admired the precision of it, the audacity, the cunning. But admiration was fleeting. It was quickly replaced by the bitter determination to dismantle everything he had built, piece by piece, until he understood the cost of underestimating me. And in that moment, I promised myself something I had never imagined. This would be more than revenge. It would be poetic, calculated, and devastating, because the boy who thought he could erase me had no idea the storm he had unleashed. The next morning, I started putting my plan into motion. I couldn't afford to rush. Revenge required patience, precision, and a cold, calculated mind. I spent hours watching his routines, learning the patterns he thought were invisible, memorizing every detail of his daily life. The boy who had once clung to me for guidance now moved like a stranger, confident and untouchable, completely unaware that I had already begun dismantling the foundation he had built. Every little piece of information I gathered felt like a weapon in my hands, and the thought of finally turning it against him sent a thrill through me I hadn't felt in years. I knew I had to start small, testing the waters without alerting him. I found opportunities in subtle ways, an overlooked account here, a forgotten password there, people who could unknowingly tip the balance in my favor. And while he believed he was untouchable, the cracks in his armor were already appearing, though he remained blissfully unaware. That smug, arrogant smile he wore whenever he thought he had beaten me was the very thing that fueled my fire. He had no idea the depth of my resolve, the darkness that had taken root in my heart the moment he betrayed me. Every night I went to bed thinking about the way I would make him pay, imagining the moment when he would finally understand the consequences of underestimating his own father. Then came the first real shock. I discovered that he had been hiding something big, something that even I hadn't anticipated. A secret account, one that held far more than he ever let on. Funds that could ruin or save him depending on whose hands they fell into. My pulse quickened as I realized the power I now held. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about control, about reclaiming the life that had been stolen from me in that brief, devastating moment when he looked at me and said I would never see him again. I could almost hear his laughter echoing in my mind, the arrogance in his tone, and I promised myself he would never laugh again without fear. The following week, I started subtly manipulating circumstances around him. I didn't need to confront him directly. My presence alone, the quiet observation, was enough to unsettle him. I began planting small seeds of doubt, carefully watching as they took root in his carefully curated life. Friends questioned him, colleagues hesitated, and even the digital world he thought he controlled began shifting beneath his feet. Every move was calculated, and every reaction I observed was feeding into the larger plan. I realized with a mixture of horror and satisfaction that the boy I once raised had underestimated the man I had become, and the thought of the storm I was building, one that would leave him exposed, terrified, and utterly powerless, gave me a grim sense of satisfaction I couldn't deny. It was late one night when I realized how deep this betrayal had really cut, not just my pride, but my sense of reality itself. I had spent years trusting him, giving him everything, only to be thrown aside like I meant nothing. I remembered the day he shook my hand and whispered those words, and I could still feel the weight of his betrayal pressing down on my chest. That memory fueled me as I meticulously planned the next move, knowing that this wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming control, about proving that no one, not even the son I had raised, could humiliate me without consequence. I began manipulating the people around him, subtly at first, planting doubts, nudging situations into disarray without anyone realizing it was me. Colleagues who once admired him started questioning his judgment. Friends who relied on him hesitated, unsure of where he really stood. Even the digital world he thought he owned started slipping through his fingers. Accounts and access points that he took for granted, now quietly shifting in my favor. It was a slow burn, a silent storm gathering strength. Watching him falter in ways he didn't even notice gave me a perverse satisfaction. But I knew this was just the beginning. The real reckoning was still to come. Then one evening I confronted him, though not with anger, not with accusations. I sat across from him at dinner, calm, smiling in a way that hid every ounce of the rage and heartbreak burning inside me. He looked at me like he had conquered some victory, unaware that I had already started dismantling his life piece by piece. I let him feel that moment, the tension thick and suffocating, the silence stretching between us. I didn't need words. The fear in his eyes, the subtle shift in his demeanor, spoke volumes. That was my first true victory, a taste of what was coming, a signal that the storm I had been building was now within striking distance. But the revelation came when I discovered the full extent of his arrogance. He had been hiding even more than I anticipated. Financial secrets, manipulations, and lies that could have easily destroyed someone else. And in that moment, I realized the magnitude of the power I now held. I wasn't just a father seeking revenge. I had become the force capable of dismantling the very life he had taken for granted. Every scheme he had crafted, every sly move was now vulnerable. And the thought of the reckoning he would face, the moment when the boy who thought he was untouchable would finally understand the consequences of underestimating his own father, sent a chill down my spine. The following morning, I realized that patience was my greatest weapon. I didn't need to confront him directly. The smallest disruptions were already making him sweat. I began subtly interfering with his contacts, sending messages to the people he relied on, planting tiny doubts that would grow into cracks in his carefully constructed world. Every reaction I observed fueled me, and I watched with quiet satisfaction as he started to stumble without even knowing why. It was intoxicating to see the arrogance drain from his posture, the confidence falter in his eyes. The boy who thought he could humiliate me had no idea that the man he had wronged was quietly orchestrating his undoing. Then came the first real shock. I uncovered a hidden investment he had made, one that he thought was untouchable, a secret stash of money he had accumulated without anyone knowing. My pulse raced as I realized the leverage it gave me. I could control the narrative now. I could make him pay in ways he had never imagined. The betrayal he had dealt me was monumental, but the power I now held gave me a sense of control that I hadn't felt in years. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: exhilaration. The storm I had been building in silence was finally becoming tangible, and he was standing right in its path, unaware. That night I invited him over under the guise of reconciliation. He came, smug, self-assured, thinking he had already won. I let him feel that comfort, that false sense of safety, before I dropped the first hint that things were no longer as he believed. I spoke calmly about his investments, about accounts, about people who had once been loyal but were now questioning him. His eyes widened, a flicker of panic breaking through the arrogance. I let him stew in that moment, the silence stretching, suffocating like a vice around his chest. And in that pause, I realized just how far I had come from the broken, betrayed father who had spent sleepless nights wondering how everything had fallen apart. But the real twist came when I discovered just how deep his web of lies went. He had been manipulating friends, colleagues, even family members to cover his tracks. Every betrayal he had planned was now vulnerable, exposed to the one person he thought he couldn't hurt, me. And that's when I understood that this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. He would be broken in a way that would make him remember that night. He looked at me and thought he could walk away without fear. By the time the next week rolled around, I could see the tension building in him. He was no longer the confident, untouchable boy I had once known. Every interaction he had with others carried hesitation. Every message he sent seemed carefully calculated, as if he suddenly realized he could no longer control the world around him. I had begun to see the first real signs of fear in his eyes, the subtle twitch in his jaw, the way he avoided direct contact with me, the moments when he thought no one was watching but I was always there, silently observing. It was intoxicating to witness, a mixture of validation and raw satisfaction that this betrayal, which had cut so deeply, was now being mirrored back to him. I decided it was time to tighten the net. I reached out to a few of his closest allies, the people he had relied on to cover his tracks and support his schemes. I spoke carefully, planting seeds of doubt, asking questions that seemed casual but were loaded with implication. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, they began to hesitate. He started getting calls and messages questioning his decisions, unsure glances in meetings, subtle remarks that hinted he might not be as in control as he thought. Watching him flounder, watching the arrogance that once seemed untouchable begin to crumble, brought a cold, dark satisfaction that I could barely contain. He had thought he was invincible, but now the illusion was shattering before his eyes. One evening, I decided to strike closer to the heart. I confronted him with evidence of his hidden accounts, subtle financial maneuvers he believed were secret. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse. I simply laid out the facts, letting the weight of truth crush him silently. He froze, the smug, untouchable expression replaced with disbelief and panic. It was beautiful in a way I hadn't expected. The quiet devastation of a boy who suddenly realized he had been outmaneuvered by the very man he had tried to destroy. And in that silence, I felt the full power of my patience, my calculated strategy, and the anger that had burned quietly inside me for weeks. But the real shock came when I uncovered his final layer of deception. He had hidden not just money, but information. Evidence of lies, manipulations, and betrayals that could ruin relationships and reputations if exposed. And now I had it. Every hidden secret, every plan he had made to undermine me was now in my hands. The realization hit me like a wave. He had given me everything I needed to make him understand what betrayal really meant, and I promised myself as I watched him nervously sip his drink that he would feel the full weight of every word he had ever whispered, every look of contempt he had ever given me. The boy who thought he could erase his father had no idea that his reckoning had only just begun. By the time the next morning came, I could see the first real cracks forming in his carefully constructed life. He was jittery, tense, every word he spoke measured and cautious. The arrogance he once wore like armor had vanished, replaced by something more dangerous, fear. I could see it in the way he glanced over his shoulder, in the tightness of his fists, in the way his voice faltered even when he tried to sound confident. For the first time, he understood that the tables had turned, that the boy who had once humiliated his father was now standing exposed, vulnerable, powerless, and I felt a grim satisfaction, the kind that seeps deep into your bones, knowing that the betrayal I had endured was finally being mirrored back to him. I began to apply more pressure, subtle but relentless. Calls from colleagues questioning his judgment, messages from friends he thought loyal, small but effective disruptions that made him doubt every decision he made. And while he tried to maintain control, the cracks were spreading. It was mesmerizing to watch someone who had once thought himself untouchable falter under the weight of consequences he had never imagined. Each hesitant glance, each moment of hesitation was a reminder that the boy who had once struck me down emotionally was now trapped in the web he had helped me weave. The real turning point came when I revealed a portion of what I had discovered about his hidden accounts. I didn't attack him outright, I simply let him see that I knew. The panic in his eyes, the quick intake of breath, the way he tried to regain composure, it was all mine to observe. He realized in that instant that nothing he had hidden from me was safe, that the control he thought he had over his life was slipping away with every calculated move I made. And the most delicious part of it all was that he had never suspected me, had never considered that I would rise from the humiliation, the heartbreak, and the betrayal, not just to survive, but to orchestrate a reckoning that would leave him shaken to his core. That night, I watched him retreat into his apartment alone, staring at screens, checking accounts, calculating strategies of his own, unaware that I had already anticipated each move. It was poetic, almost cruel. The arrogance that had driven him now turned against him, and in the quiet of my own home, I felt the bitter, satisfying thrill of revenge beginning to take shape. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about teaching a lesson he would never forget. The boy who thought he could humiliate me had no idea that his father was now the predator and he the prey, caught in a game he could not escape. By the time the next morning came, I could see the first real cracks forming in his carefully constructed life. He was jittery, tense, every word he spoke measured and cautious. The arrogance he once wore like armor had vanished, replaced by something more dangerous, fear. I could see it in the way he glanced over his shoulder, in the tightness of his fists, in the way his voice faltered even when he tried to sound confident. For the first time, he understood that the tables had turned, that the boy who had once humiliated his father was now standing exposed, vulnerable, powerless. And I felt a grim satisfaction, the kind that seeps deep into your bones, knowing that the betrayal I had endured was finally being mirrored back to him. I began to apply more pressure, subtle but relentless. Calls from colleagues questioning his judgment, messages from friends he thought loyal, small but effective disruptions that made him doubt every decision he made. And while he tried to maintain control, the cracks were spreading. It was mesmerizing to watch someone who had once thought himself untouchable falter under the weight of consequences he had never imagined. Each hesitant glance, each moment of hesitation, was a reminder that the boy who had once struck me down emotionally was now trapped in the web he had helped me weave. The real turning point came when I revealed a portion of what I had discovered about his hidden accounts. I didn't attack him outright, I simply let him see that I knew. The panic in his eyes, the quick intake of breath, the way he tried to regain composure, it was all mine to observe. He realized in that instant that nothing he had hidden from me was safe, that the control he thought he had over his life was slipping away with every calculated move I made. And the most delicious part of it all was that he had never suspected me, had never considered that I would rise from the humiliation, the heartbreak, and the betrayal. Not just to survive, but to orchestrate a reckoning that would leave him shaken to his core. That night, I watched him retreat into his apartment, alone, staring at screens, checking accounts, calculating strategies of his own, unaware that I had already anticipated each move. It was poetic, almost cruel. The arrogance that had driven him now turned against him. And in the quiet of my own home, I felt the bitter, satisfying thrill of revenge beginning to take shape. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about teaching a lesson he would never forget. The boy who thought he could humiliate me had no idea that his father was now the predator. and he the prey caught in a game he could not escape. By the middle of the week, the changes in him were impossible to ignore. He moved like a man constantly on edge, checking phones, double-checking emails, second-guessing every interaction. The boy who had once laughed at me, who had believed himself untouchable, Bakir, now carried a weight in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. I watched silently, studying the subtle shifts in his behavior, every twitch, every glance, every hesitation, feeding the dark satisfaction simmering inside me. The realization that he had underestimated me, that he had made a grave mistake in thinking he could erase me from his life, was intoxicating. I started to escalate things further. I carefully exposed some of his financial maneuvers to his closest friends, not outright revealing them, but enough to see doubt and confusion. The effect was immediate. Calls and messages began to pile up, questions and concerns subtly undermining his confidence. He had spent years constructing a facade of control, but now that facade was cracking and I was watching the pieces fall away, one by one. Each falter, each hesitant reply, each glance filled with uncertainty was proof that the storm I had been building was finally hitting its target. Then came the moment that made my pulse race. A call from one of his key associates, someone he trusted implicitly, expressing concern over recent inconsistencies. I didn't have to do anything directly. The tension I had cultivated was enough to make him question himself, his decisions, and even the loyalty of those around him. Watching him shift uneasily, realizing that the walls were closing in was a reminder of the power betrayal can bring when harnessed correctly. I had been patient, and now every ounce of that patience was paying off. That night, I confronted him again, under the pretense of trying to reconcile, but the underlying tension was palpable. I didn't raise my voice or accuse. I simply let him see that I knew that I had been aware of every move he had made, every lie, every manipulation. The panic in his eyes, the quick intake of breath, and the forced composure told me everything I needed to know. He understood in that instant that he was no longer in control, and that the reckoning he had ignored for so long had finally arrived. I realized then that the most devastating revenge isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, and inescapable, and the fear it plants is far more effective than anger alone. By the time the weekend came, I knew it was time to strike in a way he would never forget. The boy who had once humiliated me, who had thought himself untouchable, was now visibly fractured. Every move calculated, every smile forced, every word measured. I had spent weeks observing, planning, and testing, and now I had all the pieces I needed. I began pulling strings I had carefully prepared, using the hidden information I had uncovered to subtly manipulate the people he trusted most. Each phone call, each message, each conversation I influenced sent ripples through his life, small at first, then growing into waves of doubt and panic he couldn't control. The first real shock came when he discovered that one of his major investments had been frozen. I didn't have to be present, didn't have to explain, didn't have to confront him. I simply let the situation unfold naturally, letting him watch as the life he thought he controlled began unraveling before his eyes. The panic in his gaze, the tightening of his fist, the sudden hesitation in his speech, every detail fed the dark satisfaction simmering inside me. I realized then that revenge isn't about instant gratification, it's about the slow, deliberate dismantling of someone who has caused you pain, and watching the fear take root before the final strike. That night I invited him over again, ostensibly to talk, to reconcile, but the tension in the air was thick, palpable. He came trying to hide the fear, the way he shifted in his seat, trying to maintain control, but I could see it all. I let silence do the work for me, letting him squirm under the weight of unspoken truths, and then just enough to make him flinch. I mentioned a few carefully chosen details, accounts, investments, small betrayals he thought were invisible, and I watched as the color drained from his face. That moment, small but significant, confirmed what I had suspected. He had finally realized that the tables had turned and that I was no longer a man to be underestimated. But the biggest shock was yet to come. As he stumbled through the conversation, panicked, trying to regain his composure, I revealed a critical piece of information he hadn't anticipated. A secret he had buried, one that exposed him completely. The look on his face, the horror that flashed in his eyes, and the realization that he had no one to turn to, made every sleepless night, every pang of betrayal, every ounce of heartbreak I had endured worth it. He had believed he was untouchable, that he could humiliate his own father and walk away without consequence. Now he understood. The reckoning had arrived, and there was no escape. By the following morning, the reality of what I had set in motion began to fully hit him. The boy who had once looked at me with arrogance and contempt was now reduced to anxious hesitation, pacing, checking phones and accounts over and over, as if the ground beneath him had vanished. Every ally he had once counted on was suddenly unreliable. Every system he had built to protect himself suddenly fragile. I watched silently, a quiet storm brewing inside me, knowing that the fear I had nurtured was finally taking root. He had underestimated me, dismissed me, and now the consequences of that arrogance were unraveling his life, piece by piece. I decided it was time to escalate further. I contacted a few people who had previously been his supporters, friends who he thought would never betray him, and planted carefully chosen truths and subtle warnings. The effect was immediate. Messages arrived, questioning his judgment, small but strategic disruptions to his work and social life, and the once unshakable confidence in his demeanor began to crumble. The boy who had humiliated me was now trapped in his own uncertainty, a shadow of the man he had thought he was. Watching this transformation, the mix of validation, satisfaction, and bitter pain coursed through me. Revenge was no longer just a thought, it was alive, moving, unstoppable. Then came the most shocking moment yet. He discovered that his access to one of his largest investments had been completely revoked, frozen in a way that left him powerless. The panic in his eyes, the quick gulp of air, the desperate attempts to recover control, all of it was a confirmation that my plan was working. I had no need to attack him directly. The collapse of his carefully constructed life was doing the work for me. And in that quiet, powerful moment, I felt the full scope of justice and retribution, knowing that the boy who had thought he could erase his father's influence had no idea what was coming next. That evening, I confronted him one last time before the final moves of my plan. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse, I simply sat across from him, calm, composed, and let the silence hang. Then, with just a hint of a smile, I reminded him of the consequences he had ignored, the betrayals he had committed, and the secrets he had hidden. The look of disbelief and fear in his eyes was more powerful than any words I could have spoken. For the first time, he realized that the father he had tried to humiliate was now in complete control, orchestrating his downfall with precision. And in that realization, I saw the spark of understanding the moment he knew he had finally underestimated me, and that the reckoning had only just begun. By the next morning, it was clear that the fear I had cultivated was no longer subtle. It had become a presence in his life, tangible and suffocating. The boy who had once laughed at me, mocked me, and thought himself untouchable, now moved like a man under siege. Every decision weighed with hesitation, every interaction strained with anxiety. I watched him from a distance, letting the tension build, feeling the satisfaction of knowing that the very arrogance that had cut me so deeply was now crushing him in ways he had never imagined. He had believed he could humiliate his father without consequence, and now he was learning the harsh truth the hard way. I began to intensify my maneuvers, making sure that every action I took was invisible yet devastating. I leaked subtle hints of his mismanagement and secret accounts to people he trusted, just enough to make them question his reliability. Messages arrived, questions were asked, trust was shaken, and he began to falter under the weight of suspicion. The carefully constructed facade of control he had maintained for so long was now beginning to crumble, and I watched it happen with a mix of bitter satisfaction and quiet triumph. Each hesitant glance, each faltering word, was a reminder that he had underestimated the man he had betrayed. Then the shock came in a form I hadn't fully anticipated. The ripple effect of my actions began affecting his closest relationships. Friends who had once been loyal started pulling away, colleagues hesitated to support him, and even family members he relied on began questioning his intentions. I realized that the power of revenge wasn't just in the punishment itself, but in dismantling the very foundation of trust he had taken for granted. The boy who had once controlled everything was now powerless, watching his world unravel while I remained untouchable, a silent force he could no longer ignore. That night, I confronted him in a way that would haunt him forever. I didn't need to raise my voice or make threats. I let the truth speak for itself. I calmly laid out what I had uncovered. The manipulations, the hidden accounts, the betrayals he thought he had concealed. The look in his eyes, disbelief, panic, and finally fear was more satisfying than I could have imagined. He understood in that single moment that the father he had tried to humiliate was no longer a man to be trifled with. And as he sat there silent, realizing that his carefully constructed life was collapsing around him, I knew that the reckoning he had ignored for so long had finally arrived, and there was no escape. By the following week, the full weight of my plan had begun to crush him. He was no longer just anxious, he was frantic, scrambling to regain control over the life he had thought untouchable. Every call he made, every email he sent, every interaction he had was shadowed by doubt, suspicion, and fear. I watched him from the sidelines, silently reveling in the transformation. The arrogance that had once made him untouchable had been replaced by panic, a raw, visceral fear that he could no longer hide. And as I observed, I understood that this was the moment when betrayal comes full circle. The one who hurt me most was now vulnerable, exposed, and completely at my mercy. I escalated carefully, pushing him into situations where he had no choice but to confront the consequences of his own actions. Subtle but devastating leaks of information, whispered warnings to allies, manipulated financial alerts. I had orchestrated them all. He couldn't fight back, couldn't reason his way out, and the tension in his posture, the way his eyes darted nervously, revealed that he knew he was completely trapped. The boy who had humiliated me thought he was untouchable, but now he was unraveling under the weight of his own arrogance. Every carefully constructed plan undone by the quiet, deliberate patience of the man he had betrayed. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the first real confrontation that would cement the scale of his failure. I invited him over under the guise of a casual conversation, a chance to talk things through, but the truth was far more sinister. I calmly laid out the evidence, letting him see the extent of his exposure. Hidden accounts, compromised investments, the subtle betrayals he had inflicted on those he trusted most. His face went pale, his confident mask slipping as panic overtook him. The reality had finally dawned on him. He had underestimated me, and now there was no way to regain the control he had lost. And yet, even in that moment, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and vindication. He was my son, the boy I had raised, the child I had poured my life into, and yet he had betrayed me in a way that cut deeper than any wound. Watching him crumble was painful, yes, but it was also necessary. He had to understand that actions have consequences. That arrogance and betrayal have a price. And as I left him to sit there staring at the truth he could no longer escape, I knew that my revenge was almost complete. The storm I had built in silence had finally arrived, and he would never forget it. By now, it was undeniable. He was a man completely unraveling before my eyes. The boy who had once thought himself untouchable now moved like a shadow of his former self, haunted by every choice he had made, every lie he had told, and every betrayal he had committed. I watched him struggle, desperately trying to regain control, fumbling through calls and messages, panicking as he realized the people he trusted were no longer in his corner. The arrogance and contempt that had once burned so fiercely in his eyes were gone, replaced by terror and the crushing weight of realization. He had underestimated me, and the consequences were finally crashing down. I intensified my strategy, tightening the grip I had already established. I exposed his financial missteps in subtle but undeniable ways, sowing confusion among colleagues and associates he had relied on. Friends he thought loyal began to distance themselves, leaving him isolated and vulnerable. Every carefully laid plan of his now seemed fragile, every move uncertain. And the best part, the part I had been waiting for, was watching the fear take root deep inside him. It wasn't just panic, it was the slow, creeping understanding that he had created his own downfall. That the arrogance and betrayal he had wielded like a weapon against me had finally been turned back on him. Then came the final blow. Subtle but devastating, I revealed the most critical piece of evidence. The one secret he had thought was buried safely beyond my reach. The shock on his face, the pale, haunted look in his eyes, was more satisfying than any victory I could have imagined. He realized in that instant that everything he had built, every hidden account, every manipulation, every lie, was now powerless against me. I didn't need to speak a word. The panic and disbelief were enough. The boy who had kicked me aside and thought he could erase me was now powerless, broken, and finally understanding the cost of underestimating his own father. Sitting back and watching him absorb the weight of his own downfall, I felt a mix of emotions that I had never thought I would experience. There was pain because he was my son. There was anger because of the betrayal that had cut so deep. And yet there was also satisfaction, a grim but necessary sense of justice. He had believed he could humiliate me, dismiss me, and walk away untouched. But the reckoning had arrived. The storm I had built silently, patiently, methodically had finally engulfed him. And in that quiet, tense moment, I knew that the lesson had been learned in full. Betrayal has a price, arrogance has consequences, and underestimating someone you think is weak can be the gravest mistake of all. I watched him sit alone, pale and broken, the boy who once laughed at me, now stripped of pride and control. Every secret exposed, every ally questioning him, every plan undone. He had nowhere to hide. I walked in calmly, letting him absorb the truth, the weight of his betrayal finally sinking in. Revenge isn't always loud. It's patient, methodical, and devastating. He had underestimated me, and now he faced the consequences. Pain can break you, but patience and quiet strength make you unstoppable. For more gripping stories of betrayal and revenge, subscribe, like, and share.